Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about editing your resume and cover letter. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones with us to talk about editing your resume and cover letter. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. I mean, on some level, I guess it seems surprising to me that we even need to talk about this. Don't people know that they need to edit their application materials?
You'd think that they would. And I think, in OCI or when they're in a situation where they're sending out lots of resumes at the same time, maybe they're more careful. But I think it's the kind of thing that you need to keep up all the time. You never know when someone might ask for it or you might have a job opportunity. And I think that people need to make sure that they have a clean resume without typos and that, it's specific to the position that they're applying for. It's the right resume. It makes sense.
I think that's right. It's amazing how many typos we see on resumes. I mean, I would think that would never happen, but it does happen.
And it happens to all of us. That's why I would say, have multiple people look at it because we all make a mistake here and there. And so just having different eyes on it always helps.
Right. So basically, it sounds like you're talking about kind of two steps. Number one is what you're about to submit actually up to date and potentially is it tailored sufficiently for this position? And number two, is it free of any typos and does the layout look nice? Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely right. It should be pretty simple.
Right. I mean, this isn't like rocket science.
Exactly.
We are consistently surprised by what we see. All right. So let's talk about these separately. Because I think in some ways, the step about editing for content is actually harder because it's easy to think, I've got a resume and it's just my resume. And if I get a new job or something, I'll put something different on it. That's not really what we're talking about, is it?
No, it's not. And I think that, the editing for content can be hard because, over time you just gain more and more experience. And so I think some people just add on more and more to their resume and just think it's a straightforward list of everything I've ever done. And that's not really what it is. It should be specific and you need to edit yourself, which is what we're talking about, and take things out, that don't fit, the direction that you're going, the position you're applying for, or just for length, really.
I think that's right. I mean, it's always sort of funny when you see people's resumes coming out of law school or something, or even years into their legal career, and they still have the job they worked at high school, working as a barista. And it's I feel like that maybe could have come off by now.
And there's people who need filler, that don't have enough. And so sometimes, I suggest they leave something or it makes sense for some reason. But I totally agree. Whenever I see a resume, let's say that's 2 pages and they had 1 year of work experience between college and law school, I'm just like, what is going on here? How is this so long? And, usually it's a lot of unnecessary things.
Right. I think it's, sometimes people think almost they have an obligation to include every single job they've ever had. But the reality is if someone hires you and they want your entire back history, they'll ask for it, or they'll do an application for applying for the FBI or something. They probably do want to know every job you've ever had, but that won't be on your resume. It'll be on some sort of application.
Or a lot of times, employers have a separate, job application where you submit things, online. And then I think you can put everything you've ever done. And like you said, for a background check or something like that, you don't want to mislead anyone. That's different than a resume that you are expected to actively be editing and tailoring it for what you're applying for. And again, just for length.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you mentioned tailoring it. Do you think you need a completely different set of materials for every job you apply to?
Definitely not. That sounds like a lot of work.
It sounds like there are definitely going to be typos on some of those.
Yeah, exactly. So you might only have one resume if you're applying for all the same kind of jobs. So if like you're only applying to big law, or you're only applying to public interest, you're only applying to government work, then generally I think probably the same resume is going to work for all of them. I would kind of have a different resume if you're applying to different buckets, of types of jobs is really what I would say. So like, one's a private employer, one's government. Sometimes people are applying in different cities. So one might have your parents' permanent address, and the other one might have your school address. I think that's all okay. It should be tailored to the city that you're applying for. You want to make the case for. It's okay to have multiple. Just keep them straight.
Right. I mean, I think when you're thinking about should I have a different one, you've got to think through, well, why? Like you said, if it's like you're applying all to private employers in the same city, then probably not. But once you start getting into different locations or different types of jobs, I think you do want to sit down and have that very perfect version ready to go for each of those things. I mean, how can people figure out what should go into this particular application if they're thinking about what to take out or what to add?
Well, I think you need to ask yourself, okay, if I'm the employer and I'm looking at this, what story is it telling? So, for example, like I said, with the cities, do you have connections to that city? Does your resume explain that? Or is there something that you can do in the resume to show, that you've spent time in that city or you have a connection? Obviously, you can do that in the cover letter as well. And you should never fudge anything that isn't true in the resume. So it all has to, be correct. But, that's one example. So you might want to take out some things that showed you spent, a lot of time in a different city that you were also looking at if that isn't going to be relevant to the work you're doing. Like you said, you had, let's say, summer jobs in high school or college that just aren't relevant, or you have more recent experience that, makes more sense or is more professional. You just start taking off the stuff that's older. I also think you just need to, use good judgment about how long you're writing under each job. So you want to write the most under jobs that are most relevant to legal work or to the type of work that you're applying to. And maybe you only have one sentence. If it was just like a summer internship, that's only slightly relevant. So I think you just want to give the most space and, the most attention to the things that make sense for that job.
I think that's a great tip. I mean, sometimes people get really worked up about I don't want to take this job off. And I think, well, you don't have to take it off, but you can also de-emphasize it in terms of how much screen real estate you're giving to it. So if you have a job that's particularly relevant, then go ahead and detail, every single thing that you did there that you think they might want to look at. If you did a lot of stuff that's in the job description, go ahead and talk a lot about that. But if there's another job that maybe you took your 1L summer that's less relevant, you don't have to put the same amount of information. So a lot of this is just about kind of how you tailor things. It's not exactly what you leave on or off. You can have them all there, just differently emphasized.
Or sometimes I see it where people kind of volunteered at the same exact type of organization and they have like 4 different ones of basically the same kind of work. And maybe you leave them all on, but if you don't have enough room, like you just say, okay, what's the 1 or 2 that's most relevant? Because I do notice when things start looking repetitive, and then you kind of have to explain like, why did I keep kind of doing the same thing over and over again? So that's something that I would say, maybe you just take some off. I think people feel a lot of times connected to each thing they've ever done. And so it can be really hard to make that decision. And that's why sometimes it's good to have somebody else, look at it and make that decision for you. 'Cause for whatever reason, people feel really connected to all the jobs they've ever done.
Yeah, they're very invested in them. I think that's right. Yeah, and I think this idea about getting help if you don't know can be really useful. Just getting an outside opinion, whether it's, a friend of yours or someone in career services or an outside consultant, whoever, just to kind of say, okay, this seems to be the type of stuff you're looking for. Here's what you're giving me about your background. This is how I see this matching up. Do you agree with that or disagree with it? And then you can kind of get into the shaping of it But I think, like you said, if you're very, very invested in like everything you've ever done, it can be hard to take that step back and say, okay, maybe in reality, that time I volunteered at that place, which was very personally meaningful, but maybe is not such a great selling point for this particular opportunity.
Exactly. And I would say if you go into that situation, whether it's a friend or professional, be open-minded to somebody else's view of your resume, and take what they're saying, as well as you can. I think you have to go into it not being defensive, and maybe what they say turns out to not be the best, decision, and you explain to them why you think it's really important to leave this in, and then maybe you take something else out. But it's sort of like editing, anything. Like some things that you thought were great sometimes have to come out just because people aren't going to read through something that's too long.
Right. Yeah, another place I think people often need to edit is say they've had, been in a role, been in an organization for like, 5 years or something, and they've had different roles in that organization. And sometimes people really want to draw that out into like 3 different jobs, and each is presented as if it's a different job and you get the full detail. I just feel like that's too much. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think it's good to kind of maybe write the different positions to show that like you got a promotion.
Oh, definitely.
Or you got 2 promotions. But generally, they're going to be just like moving up in the same area. So I think it's fine to put them sort of all under one, paragraph of all the things you've done in that area. So I totally agree. And it gets confusing,
Right, exactly.
like, is this a different company? What were the dates? I always find that kind of jumbled.
Yeah, and often it's a little bit of like a slightly different name change of like you're the associate this, and then you're the assistant this, and it's like, wait, what are these things? Like I don't understand what's happening right now. So
because what I really think is you have to make it as clear as possible. That's the most important thing. So I think that a lot of students think the most important thing is just the substance and that I did all these things. But ultimately, if they're not going to understand what your path was or, what you're trying to say, and they're not even going to bother to read it, then it doesn't matter what you said.
And I think, in a situation like that where you have progressed through a series of things, it's actually nice to say sometimes in the description, like promoted from X to Y to Z over the course of X years or something. You have to really draw attention to that if it's something that you do feel proud of and you think is meaningful. But just to kind of put them all on there is like, I don't know what this is about.
I totally agree with you. And something like that makes it really clear to the reader. And so that's great. Just say it. It's not like some kind of puzzle they need to put together.
Yeah, and I think that's like a key takeaway from all of this is you got to make it easy for people to understand what you want them to get out of this. So your background better than anyone. And the role of these materials is to explain to someone who doesn't know you why they should care. And, the more that it's like, okay, this person has a clear cover letter. It tells me why they're interested, why they think they're qualified. And then their resume builds on that. And it tells me a clear story. And I can see, whatever it is they want to tell me. Great. Maybe it's not a great fit, but if it is a good fit, then you're likely to get an interview. And that's kind of what the goal is here.
Absolutely. You're trying to tell a story. You're trying to make it easy to read. You're trying to show why you make sense for that job and what your background brings to it. And that's it. You don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes underestimate the value of the non-resume stuff too, which is really important. If the employer has asked you to fill out a questionnaire, like that's an opportunity to basically explain to them why you're a good fit. If they ask for a cover letter, that's a great opportunity to explain to them why you're a good fit. So people sometimes, I think, get a little over obsessed maybe with the resume and kind of ignore these other things or think that they're a throwaway, but I really don't think they are.
I totally agree. And I think that each one has a different purpose, and you should go in knowing what the purpose is. So the resume is really just to tell your job history, your career progression, some of the highlights. And then your cover letter can explain things in more detail, can explain things that are maybe confusing, something like strange on your resume. We've talked about that before. And then your interview is to show who you are. So these all have different purposes and they're not all the same.
Right. And they all kind of have to fit together if you're going to have a successful job offer. Well, let's talk about a couple of specific questions around content that we sometimes get. When do you think the positioning of the education and the experience section should flip? So typically out of school, people are going to have their education at the top because that's most relevant. But at what point do you think that changes?
So I don't think it's an exact point for everybody. Like I wouldn't say, oh, X number of years is the exact point where you flip it. I would say, yeah, absolutely out of school, the school has to come on, the top. I would say it's probably maybe after job number 2, but it depends on how long you were at that job. So there might be someone who has their first job and they're in that job for 5 years and they gained a lot of experience and they're applying to the second job that makes sense for that experience. Then I would move the experience to the top because that's the thing you most want to highlight. So basically you keep the education at the top if you don't have that much solid work experience. So like your education is probably going to be the most relevant, the school you went to, any achievements, things like that. So, it's somewhere where you're sort of like moving along in your career, you're past the like super junior point.
Right. And I think it also depends on which is most impressive. So if you have, really impressive school credentials, you might keep that up there longer than if you went to sort of a middling school and now you've had the really great work experience. Yeah, I think the one exception when you're coming straight out of school is if you if this is a second career, like maybe then there's an argument for keeping your work experience at the top. But I think you just want to think through what is most impressive and most relevant. And this is kind of the overall point on all of this. It's not, we can't give you a firm answer because it's really going to depend on what your situation looks like.
Absolutely. And what the job is, are you applying to a JD Advantage job where, having that law degree might not be the most important, maybe other work experience matters more. So, I would also, again, get outside opinions to see how other people read it for that job.
Yeah, because if you have a great educational experience, you don't want to like hide that at the very bottom. And everyone's like, oh, they're double Harvard. I wouldn't have guessed that,
Yeah, exactly. So obviously the stuff at the top is, the first thing they're going to see. So it should be the most important.
Right. You briefly alluded to this earlier. How long is too long for a resume or a cover letter?
So I feel very, very, very strongly that a resume should not be longer than a page. A cover letter should definitely not be longer than a page. A cover letter really should be like 4 paragraphs. There are exceptions. So a resume can be longer than a page if you are much more into your career. I'm talking about more than 10 years of experience is sort of how I think of it. Or there are some exceptions, like you have published a lot of pieces, you have some kind of technical degrees, so you need to explain, your own research. But I'm talking about the majority of people, that we're talking to should definitely not have a resume that's longer than a page.
I agree. I think there should be a very good reason to do it. And obviously there are like academic resumes that are more like CV style. Fine. We're not talking about those. We're talking about kind of like the basic legal jobs that you are applying for. I agree. There should be a very, very, very good reason to go over 1 page. And if it does go over a page, it needs to be over 1.5 pages.
Yeah, the worst is when it just goes over a page and it does look like a mistake, that they didn't put it in PDF format and make sure that it fit exactly. And a big pet peeve of mine is when somebody, either went straight through or only has a couple years of experience and gives me a 2-page resume. I don't even want to look at it.
It's just kind of silly.
It just sends a really bad message. Yeah.
It's sort of not like, good. Really? Could you not have edited this?
Yeah.
It doesn't like speak well to your ability to like write to, a word limit, which you're probably going to be doing if you're working in a legal situation. So, part of this is about seeing like, okay, is this a person that seems like they would be able to write legal documents? And if you're not concise, then you probably cannot do that.
I think that some people really don't understand that it's okay to take stuff off too. Like they think that it's somehow misleading not to have everything they've ever done.
Right.
And that's not true. It's expected that you're not going to have everything you've ever done. You're going to have the relevant things. And there's probably another opportunity, like we said, on an application or background check where you put everything, and that's different.
I will say one thing that we haven't mentioned yet that I don't think people should edit out, that sometimes they try to, are dates on things. And I think people usually do this either if they think they have too little or too much experience. But honestly, it just draws more attention to the fact that you're trying to hide something at that point.
Absolutely. It just looks suspicious.
It just looks weird. You're like, why is there no date on anything? Huh, I wonder what's going on here. So I think it's just better to be straightforward. And,
and along those lines, you need to have a date for when you graduated law school. I don't care how far out of school you are. I don't think that looks good.
I just think it looks strange. All right, well, let's move on before we run out of time to our second big question, which is editing for typos and kind of appearance. So what are some common problems that you see with layouts, particularly for the resume?
So my number one that I always look for when I'm starting to edit a resume, and that I think is the biggest issue, is that people's dates don't line up with the right side correctly. And that drives me absolutely nuts.
I agree with you. If you're going to try to justify something, it needs to actually be justified correctly.
Exactly. It has to go right till the end. And that all needs to line up the same for every job. So it should be really consistent. So if you have city and state and then year on that same line, make sure it's on everyone like that. Or if they line up with the title, the dates line up with your title at your job or the job name, whatever it is, just make sure that everyone looks the same. I'll tell you that recruiters look at things like that it all lines up. Obviously, just basic typos, things that are misspelled, extra spaces. You'd be really surprised. A lot of times people misspell the biggest things on the resume, like the things that are in capital letters or the name of their school. Also make sure, yes,
I went to Columbia,
the name of their employer.
Not the school, but the country.
Yeah. There's some really surprising things. I think sometimes because some of that stuff you look at over and over again, and so somehow you've blanked on really reading it.
Right.
Also in terms of consistency, if you abbreviate a state, you need to abbreviate all the states. I really like everything to be the same.
Oh my God. I agree with you so much on that. I swear, every time I edit a lot of resumes for other people. And it's oh my God, do you not see that this has why is half of this done one way and half of it done the other way? Can you please just make it consistent? If you're going to spell out California, spell it out everywhere, or don't pick and choose. This is insane. How do you not see this?
Absolutely. Something else I think might not be obvious to people is that you should print it out and look at it on a printed piece of paper. That you see different things than you do on a computer screen, and you should go line by line and make sure you're looking at each line. And so you need to really do that, whether you need to go somewhere else to print it because you don't have a printer. I think it's really important.
Oh, I definitely agree. I think you can't catch things on the screen necessarily. I will say, however, you should use spell check on the screen as sort of your first line of defense. And if you see a little squiggle, you need to figure out why that is there.
Absolutely. And a lot of times, it doesn't mean anything your computer didn't know how to spell something, but at least it's fine. Something in your brain to look at that. The other thing I like to do is use that little paragraph button so you can even see the spaces individually, because you'll know if you have extra spaces then, or that things don't line up, like I said, on the right side. You'll see that then.
Yeah, one of the things I also find with layouts is sometimes people think they can use really tiny font if they're trying to fit a bunch of stuff on. And yes. I feel like you get to a certain point where that's just not okay. No one can read it.
I totally agree. And, I think there are ways to fudge it a little bit.
Margins.
You can make some things, exactly. Margins are the number one thing. You don't need really big margins. But also with that, there shouldn't be no margins. I've
Right.
seen ridiculous resumes that have no white space anywhere. And, you know, that also says to me, you don't know how to edit. It definitely shouldn't be so small you can't read it. It completely defeats the point of leaving the stuff you left in there because they're not going to read it. No one's going to like, you know, magnify your font bigger so they can see it. So there's another example where I might have a few people take a look at it, maybe even people of different ages, because you don't know who's going to be looking at it, and say, can you clearly read this? And if they say they can't, take that into account and maybe say, like, I kind of think like font 12, maybe 11 is the smallest. You should not be using 10.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, it depends a little bit on the exact font, but basically I think that's a good rule of thumb because like you said, you know, if people have to search for their reading glasses, they're probably not going to be favorably inclined to like look at this. I also think people have to be careful with using a lot of formatting. So a lot of like bold, underline, italics, like it's fine to use that. And I think you absolutely should use it to highlight very important things or like kind of give people an overview of the resume at a glance. You know, that kind of thing is really great. But at some point it becomes distracting. And I think you just have to be really cognizant of that as you're designing your resume.
I totally agree. And, you know, we're talking about legal resumes. You know, there might be different jobs where maybe something like a little jazzier might make sense.
This is not jazzy world.
Right. So I would say with legal resumes, like it should be boring. It should just be easy to read. It should be a really basic template of a resume. It bothers me when I see those like design resumes for this, and it might totally make sense for these design jobs, but it does not make sense for a legal resume, and no one wants to see it. Or colored paper, like purple, when you send resumes in the mail. Yeah.
I agree. This should be like pretty boring. I mean, I think you can find decent templates in a variety of places. You just want to pick one that's pretty simple. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't want to think about whether my stuff lines up on the right, not a problem. Just don't have stuff right aligned. You know, like there are easier or harder ways to do this, and some of them might arguably look slightly better or worse, but nobody's going to reject you because you only have things left justified.
And as a tip, Harvard and Yale law schools both have really great templates for legal resumes and cover letters, and I direct people there all the time. They have a lot of them. Nice. And they're, you know, well done and basic and boring. That's fine.
Totally fine. We're not applying for like a job at the circus here. You're applying to be a lawyer. Lawyers are boring. All right. Well, before we run out of time here, let's talk a little bit more about typos, because those are really the bane of the existence on every like cover letter and resume that have them. So you've mentioned editing on paper. What else should people do to really try to avoid this?
Have multiple people read it and ask them to really review it. Different people, and preferably people who have never seen your resume before. Because I think the biggest problem is that you're looking at your resume over and over again. We all have that problem. We don't see it. I think sometimes it's good to read the whole resume to yourself aloud. You find things out when you say them, like this sentence doesn't sound right.
Like what is this?
Yeah. I think that's like a really good way, you know, to proof things. And so a resume, it might not seem obvious to do that because it's not like a piece of writing, you know, the way like a paper is, but at least you've like looked at every single thing, you know, from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. I also think that sometimes people have a resume that they're using over and over again, and maybe they haven't looked at it a while. Someone asks for a resume, you're like, oh, I have that last one I saved, and you just send it. You should always read everything before you send it. And when you attach it to an email, you should open it up and make sure the title is what you wanted and make sure it is the correct document. I open everything I ever send to anyone because we've all made those mistakes. So I think that you should always be updating it, but also, you know, there might have been a typo that you missed 6 months ago, and that might feel embarrassing now that you sent it to a bunch of people, but at least you found it now and you didn't send it to more people.
Yeah, no, I've heard some horror stories about people who like make some changes at the last minute, or they were like in a process of editing and they thought something was final and they didn't save it as final. And then they leave out like an entire chunk, for example, of their education, or like a huge job thing. I mean, it's kind of disastrous. So you definitely want to look at what you're sending. I think you alluded to this earlier. You probably want to send as a PDF, not as some sort of editable document if you can. I think unless they specifically ask you to send some other type, you should always send as a PDF because that lets you control the formatting, lets nobody can edit it, all of these kind of things.
And if they ask you for whatever reason you have to send it as a Word document, like make sure that you've resaved it as a new Word document. There's no like former versions in there.
Right,
I see that all changes. The time. Yes.
All that kind of stuff. Make sure it's super clean. I mean, you can also, with your paper version, literally go line by line with a ruler or a piece of paper. You can read it backwards, to look at each word. But if you're going to send something out 100 times, you want it to be absolutely perfect.
I couldn't agree more. And I just think that people lose sight of the little things, because they're really focused on what they wrote under X job. And I really think that the formatting and the way it looks and any silly mistakes those are the things that are going to stand out more than them just like, browsing through your work experience.
Right.
I really look at those kind of mistakes more than anything.
Unfortunately, that's what jumps out,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well,
so I think just having multiple people, look at it is really, really important.
I agree. What if somebody has done their best, but then they realize there's a problem after they have submitted it? What should they do?
So my advice is just to say you have an updated resume and to send it and to say, could you please replace any copies of my resume with this version? I don't think that you need to point out what the mistake was, unless it was something that like, I can't think of a mistake where you'd have to point it out, but like you wrote the wrong school or something like
and honestly,
something where you'd have to tell them.
In addition to correcting the mistake, I mean, I might also just like add a line or two to like, so that maybe they pay more attention to that than like the correcting mistake. But yeah, I think that's a good strategy. Just don't make a big deal out of it, but you do want to make sure if it's something major that someone actually has the correct information.
And if you're like going to an interview after or something, make sure you have copies of the new one. Like, just in case you had an old version, I want to give you my most updated resume.
Right. And I don't think you have to do this for like a minor typo, but we're talking about like something pretty major here.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we're about out of time here. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thought is really what I said about it just being like simple and easy to read. You kind of get like a quick first impression of a resume, and I just look and make sure everything seems like it's in the right place, everything lines up, no big typos stand out. Like as a recruiter, that's the first thing I look at. And so I would really keep that in mind if I were a student over wanting to like fit everything in. That how it reads and it being easy to read is absolutely the most important thing with a resume.
Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, including on your resume and cover letter, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.